We owe our many friends in Germany for inventing this sort of occasion, when a distinguished scholar would reach an age of esteem, not necessarily of getting too old. Their colleagues and former students and people who had been very blessed by their contributions to the Academy would write a collection of papers for them that they would gather together, normally on the occasion of a special birthday, and put them together in a special book called a Festschriften, literally a birthday writing. And normally that age would be sort of north of 65 in Europe. I'm not going to give away our honoured guest's age this evening, but I think Leo Lefebvre may give away that tomorrow afternoon. And then they present a book afterwards to them, but it's a celebration in honour of a special moment in their life and career. Now, Peter Phan is going to be one of the distinguished people who will have had two Festschriften, because two of his former students who are here with us today, and we were delighted to have them, Jonathan Tan and Anne Tran, produced a wonderful collection of writings for him last year, and it was presented to him in a special session at the Catholic Theological Society of America. But we could not let it be said that a prophet is only without honour in his own country. So we had to also mark Peter's achievements here at Georgetown, and we have some wonderful people gathered over the next 2 days. So this evening we are going to begin by looking at one of the many areas of Peter's achievements and areas of focus and contribution, being religious interreligiously, the wider ecumenism and interreligious dialogue. And I'm honoured that this evening we have to introduce our evening and to welcome you all on behalf of the university, our Vice President Thomas Banchoff, who is the Vice President for Global Engagement and also the Founding Director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, who have helped make this possible tonight. So please join me in welcoming our Vice President, Tom Banchoff.
Well, this is, as Jared said, a wonderful occasion. Peter, colleagues, friends, I do bring greetings on behalf of the university, President DeGioia, our entire community. I'm delighted to welcome you officially to this 2-day conference, which, as you know, carries the title Theology Without Borders. Now, usually what comes after the colon is not that important. You can sometimes leave it off completely, but not in this case. This is our opportunity, as Jared said, to celebrate the legacy, the friendship, the collegiality of Peter C. Phan. It's a wonderful occasion on many levels, I think you'll agree. First, it's a great gift to be able to celebrate someone's legacy with them in conversation. Doesn't always happen. But in the case of Peter, there's such a body of work, such a range of contributions to the field of theology, that we already have a legacy, a living legacy, to celebrate and build on. And the organizers, first and foremost, Jared, Peter's friend and colleague, have put together, as you can see, an excellent program. I want to thank all of you who will be participating, formally, informally. Many of you have come from quite a distance. We have a range of fascinating topics to delve into: ecumenism and religious pluralism, issues of social justice and eschatology, world Christianities, and beyond. These topics, and others like them, really embody Peter's contributions to theology. His theology is, I think you'll agree, truly without borders. In his long and distinguished career, he's grappled with big questions. He's helped us to invent and think anew big questions, questions that open Catholicism as a living tradition to the world around it, to the world around us, to the reality of religious pluralism, of social injustice on a global scale, of the mysteries of suffering, death, and redemption in the lived religions of Asia, the United States, and all of global humanity. Now, Peter's long and distinguished academic career began in Vietnam, where he graduated from college, and I don't want to give away your age here, but he did graduate in 1968, at a young age, I might add, majoring in French, Latin, and the history of philosophy. From there, he entered the religious life and continued his studies in Rome, earning a doctorate of sacred theology and then a doctorate in philosophy from the University of London. Peter came to the United States as a refugee in 1975. His first academic station here in the U.S. was the University of Dallas, and he moved from there I'm simplifying a bit, but he moved from there to Catholic University here across town, where he served as chair of the Department of Theology. And here at Georgetown, his current academic home is our Department of Theology, where he holds the Ignacio Ellacuría Chair of Catholic Social Thought. Now, on this academic odyssey, which has brought us together this afternoon, Peter has already written and edited more than 30 books, published more than 100 journal articles, as well as innumerable book chapters and encyclopedia entries. His work has been translated into 10 languages, from Italian to Chinese and Indonesian. And this prodigious output has contributed to and enriched well-established literatures in ecclesiology, Christology, Missology, patristics, and other fields. But it is Peter's creativity, his remarkable creativity, his pioneering work on the borders of theology, or on the boundaries of theology, that is, I think at least, as one of the consumers of his scholarship, his greatest living legacy. Some of his most important book titles, again, in my reading, illustrate this striking originality. Christianity with an Asian Face. Being Religious Interreligiously. My spell checker still doesn't like that word, but when it makes it in, it'll be because of your hard work. Most recently, The Joy of Religious Pluralism, and I think that title captures quite a bit of what it is we're here to celebrate today and tomorrow. These and Peter's other works are penetrating, thought-provoking efforts to live out the theological promise of Vatican II, with its opening to other religious traditions, to issues of global social justice, to the wider secular culture, and to a truly global horizon for the Church. Along the way, as you know, Peter has accumulated quite a few honors in the service of the wider theological profession. He served on multiple editorial boards, accumulated book and article awards, and has 3, is that right, honorary doctorates thus far. In 2010, he was awarded the John Courtney Murray Award for Distinguished Achievement in Theology from the Catholic Theological Society of America, an organization which he has previously served as president. And more recently, in 2015, he was elected president of the American Theological Society. Now, rather than continue with this impressive record, with these accolades, and there are many more, just want to say a few words that really emphasize the personal and interpersonal vibrancy of Peter's life and work. Peter, you've been a generous mentor to so many scholars, so many theologians. I was going to say young theologians, but some of them are also getting on in years. Here at Georgetown, you were the founding director of our PhD program, which is a pioneering effort to grapple with issues of religious pluralism at the graduate, at the doctoral level. And I just want to add a personal word from the point of view of my current role. We've worked together in the context of the Berkeley Center. We worked together with Dean Chester Gillis, who's on the first panel on different projects. But in my current role as Vice President for Global Engagement, you've been a great ally. You're a great ambassador for Georgetown around the world. As a Catholic and Jesuit university trying to make sense of this world that you've spent so many years, decades now, helping us to better understand. So, Peter, you're valued by all of us here at Georgetown, not just for your remarkable scholarship and your contributions to our academic community, but also for your wisdom, your wit, your warmth, and your friendship. We look forward to this opportunity to explore your ideas together today and tomorrow, ideas that continue to engage, even excite us, as we seek to think theology creatively in your spirit, without borders of discipline, culture, tradition, or geography. So, thank you all for being here. We have our panelists here, and Jared will introduce the panel, but I thought it might be fitting in the spirit of this occasion to offer up a first round of applause in recognition of our colleague Peter Finch.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that warm welcome to everybody. I should have clarified at the beginning, just for those of you who might be wondering, the term legacy has different sort of subtle meanings across different sides of the Atlantic. For anyone wondering, Peter Fan is not dead. He's alive and in rude health, sitting here in the front row. And nor, for those of you looking for a job, somebody emailed Peter recently and said he's not retiring either. So legacy in terms of ongoing contribution. So our first speaker this evening, I'm delighted to introduce, is another good friend and another Georgetown colleague, John Borelli, who is Special Assistant in Catholic Identity and Dialogue to President Jack DeGioia here at Georgetown. Returning from a tour in Vietnam, so he has a lot in common with Peter, Borelli finished his doctorate in the history of religions and theology in 1976, while also teaching full-time. After 11 years teaching in New York, he accepted a position with the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, promoting ecumenical and interreligious relations. Since 2003, John has been here at Georgetown, where he teaches, manages conferences, coordinates dialogue and mission for the Jesuit Conference, facilitates workshops, and promotes university relations with offices and institutes of the Holy See, the Vatican. He has edited or co-authored 5 books and published over 200 articles, including The Quest for Unity, Orthodox and Catholics in Dialogue, the New Catholic Encyclopedia, and the Handbook for Interreligious Dialogue. John has a BA from St. Louis University and a PhD from Fordham University, 2 other great Jesuit schools. Please join me in welcoming John Borelli.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Scholars have made a great deal of Vatican II as an event, a noteworthy occurrence with major consequences and questions of continuity and discontinuity. Joseph Komanchek and John O'Malley, who's here, and many others have written about this. The Council was not only a series of discrete historical events, but can be studied in various groupings and relationships. But the Council functioned as a whole, almost an independent reality, interacting with the human actors who attempted to manage outcomes with varying degrees of success and mostly lack of success. We are still living that event in the sense of its intended and unintended consequences. An Israeli official, Maurice Fischer, someone Pope John XXIII had known during his time as papal nuncio in Paris, visited him in February 1959, within the first month after the Pope's surprise announcement of the Council, to gain some idea of what the Pope had in mind for his Council, especially regarding the tiny 11-year-old Jewish state of Israel. The transition team for Pope John must have been asleep at the wheel to allow someone, an Israeli official, no diplomatic relations, and a Jew to have an audience with the Pope. But the record in the archives of the Israeli government indicates so. Fischer came away frustrated that the Pope had little idea of what his council would do, or at least couldn't understand what the Pope was talking about. Neither of them had any idea in the first month that this council would come out with an extraordinary declaration with major consequences, not only on Catholic-Jewish relations, but on interreligious relations. Now, numerous pioneers in Catholic theology were also boldly asking questions in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and were being punished for even asking prophetic questions. Lambert Baudouin, John Courtney Murray, Yves Congar, Louis Massignon, to name 4. Their questions would become food for the event of Vatican II and find a way onto its agenda. Baudouin had speculated with Father Angelo Roncalli about the need for an organized liturgical movement as well as an organized ecumenical movement for Catholics. Both were exiled for suspicion of modernism. They met up in exile in early 1945 in Paris, in post-liberation Paris, and continued asking their dangerous questions about the church, development, change, and the need for a council. During the war, John Courtney Murray dared to ask about intercreedal cooperation with Protestants and Jews. Yves Congarde asked whether elements of grace and truth might be found in other Christian communities. And Louis Massignon was asking whether those who follow the faith linked through sacred narrative to Abraham, the father of faith, through Ishmael, might deserve more attention and respect than traditionally given to them as Saracens. Now, as Vatican II was unfolding from 1962 to 65, I was in a diocesan seminary in Oklahoma, in high school and college, and I believe Peter was doing about the same thing in Vietnam. We eventually heard the names of some of these pioneers and others. Now, Peter and I are the same age, at least according to his legitimate birth certificate. Because there are two. There's the one altered by his father, so he could get a 2-for-1 discount if Peter went to school with his older brother. Is that right?
To take the exam, I was old enough to take the exam, so we have to bump up the age.
Bump up the age. So there's a birther controversy here.
That's why it has two vestures.
Yes. So, anyway, Nostra Aetate was the document of Vatican II that ended up having much to do with both of our careers these past 40-plus years. That document alone proves how much of an event, in a larger sense of the term, that Vatican II was. When Pope John received his friend and trusted associate, Cardinal Augustin Bea, for the first time, with Bea as president of the Pope's newly established Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, all they could agree upon in September 1960 was that the Secretariat would facilitate relations with Jews in the preparations for the Council. Just as no one really controlled Vatican II, not Paul VI, who succeeded Pope John, and intervened using John's words all over the place in the Council, no one could quite control its outcomes, nor could anyone or any other group in the so-called majority control it. But once the idea of a draft on the Jews emerged, it took on a life of its own too. Actually, it had at least 5 lives because it survived 4 near-death experiences. Bea had the most control over the shortest of the documents, but even he could not predict the outcome. And had the Commission on Mission not been a battleground between curial leadership and the missionary bishops, spurred on by Jesuit, Salesian, missionaries of Africa, and other missionaries, the questions they were asking about being religious in an interreligious context, we might have seen the questions Peter raised within the context of a different document on missions. Much of what Peter asked in his book, Being Religious Interreligiously, might be different questions had that happened. But it didn't happen. We got the 1,141 Latin words of Nostra Aetate, each one measured and playing a particularly important role. So if Catholics were encouraged to recognize, preserve, and foster the good things, spiritual and moral, as well as the socio-cultural values found among the followers of other religions through conversations and collaboration with them carried out with prudence and love and in witness to the Christian faith and life, then Catholics would also want to ask questions about their own faith and their faith and practice and how it can be enhanced, learning from their experiences and collaborations with these friends. It was only logical that Catholic scholars, encouraged to discern what is true and holy in these religions and what these rays of that truth which enlightens all are to be found among religions, would begin asking questions on the relationship and relevance of these various religions with one another. And if Catholic scholars are encouraged to make sincere efforts for mutual understanding so as to work together for the preservation and fostering of social justice, moral welfare, peace, and freedom for all humankind, and to foster and commend mutual understanding and esteem, the fruit above all of biblical and theological studies and of friendly conversations, they must be free to ask consequential questions across borders. Nostra Aetate was promulgated during a period of great change. A further consequence would be a new generation of prophetic questioners, some already barely present at the council by a few years, noting how the times they are a-changing. If the trends in the 1960s in communications, travel, decolonization, globalization, economic interdependence, cultural revolution, renewed emphasis on local talent, and embodied church life were to continue, prophets would emerge and point out that many new ways to be religious would mean being religious interreligiously. New terms came into theological reflection. Evangelization with an expanded meaning, in spite of the fact that the followers of other religions remain suspicious of our intentions. Inculturation, dialogue of religious experience, religious pluralism, liberation theology, and so on. By 1996, Joseph Ratzinger, a young priest and professor in Bonn at the time of the council and personal theologian of Cardinal Frings of Cologne, had become a cardinal and prefect of the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith. To a group of missionary bishops from Asia in September of that year, he shared his worries about another term applied theologically, relativism. He told them that relativism had succeeded the more radical form of liberation theology as, quote, the central problem for the faith at this present time. I hope our Vietnamese theologian was paying attention. By now at the Catholic University of America, especially this quotation from that talk that Origen's conveniently published for him. In the relativist meaning, to dialogue means to put one's own position, that is, one faith, on the same level as the convictions of others without recognizing in principle more truth in it than that which is attributed to the opinions of others. Only if I suppose in principle that the other can be as right or more right than I can an authentic dialogue take place. To remedy this situation, 4 years later, Cardinal Ratzinger launched another unintended consequence of Vatican II, namely the Declaration Dominus Jesus, on the unicity and salvific universality of Jesus Christ and the Church. So important were the concerns of the congregation, the former Holy Office, that they produced a new theological term for added emphasis, unicity. Most of us in this room experienced the event of Dominus Jesus that took on a life of its own and managed to interfere with the work flowing out of the initiatives of Vatican II. In addition to its harsh tone, which ecumenical interreligious partners in dialogue found offensive, the declaration was greatly flawed on doctrinal grounds, and I point out 7 of those, but I'll just mention the 7th. Assuming that the Jews, who by this time had developed a deep affection of Pope John Paul II, would not be offended by the relative obscure reference to them. The passage is so obscure that it is meaningless, namely, aware of the universal gift of salvation offered by the Father through Jesus Christ and the Spirit, that the, quote, the first Christians encountered the Jewish people, as though in contradiction to one of the major points of Nostra Aetate 4, that the apostles, the church's foundation, stones and pillars, as well as most of the early disciples who proclaimed the gospel of Christ to the world, sprang from the Jewish people. And they were not really Jews. We entered into a new era when Dominus Jesus and the conciliar text, and not the conciliar text, became a litmus test. When asked about it, I said the text was sloppy in its theological presentation of conciliar and post-conciliar teaching. I was not fired from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, but I was not promoted either. Those of us who work for the church, whether in Rome or in other places, would experience consequences for the words that we chose, despite the fact that church officials, several bishops in the United States, and chief among these officials, Cardinal Cassidy and Bishop Cosper of the Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity, were critical of the text. I've always wondered why they would not admit that they produced a flawed text, because they spent 2 hours presenting it to the press, and AP put a headline on the story their reporter attended and wrote out, "Only Catholics can be saved." True to his Asian heritage and life as a decolonized scholar who knew how to inhabit the worlds of oppressor and oppressed, our Vietnamese theologian began a 3-part series for Orbis Press as his way of dealing with the questions that Dominus Jesus was concerned about, and the whole of Asia too. He took his cue from the Federation of Asian Bishops Conferences, whose documents and workshops were leading the way into an interreligious future for the Church, knowing that the world had changed even significantly from the time of Vatican II, when the Church finally came to terms with modernity. The Asian bishops saw fresh challenges in the postmodern and globalized era. They called for 3 dialogues for Christians in Asia, with the Asian peoples, especially with the poor, with their own Asian cultures, and with the religions of Asia, which frankly include all the religions named in Nostra Aetate. Peter first wrote Theology with an Asian Face, and then In Our Tongues, and then he turned to the interreligious arena with Being Religious Interreligiously. There are 7 places where you can, in Being Religious Interreligiously, find out what Peter wrote about Dominus Jesus. He described initially as a chilling warning to those engaged in the enterprise not to move beyond the pale of Roman Orthodoxy. As a return favor, in its 2007 clarifications required by the book Being Religious Interreligiously, the Committee on Doctrine of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops cited Dominus Jesus 14 times. It's no small book, 290 pages of text in relatively small type. It's not the only place he addresses questions of Christology, pneumatology, Trinitarian theology, religious pluralism, religious belonging, and the like. And they found only 3 areas, and in the end asserted that Being Religious Interreligiously addresses a number of crucial issues, but contains certain pervading ambiguities and equivocations that could easily confuse or mislead the faithful, as well as statements that, unless properly clarified, are not in accord with Catholic teaching. Jacques Dupuy and several Asian theologians around this time were charged with similar ambiguity in their writings, echoing the concerns 80 years earlier that certain persons teaching in Rome were guilty of modernism. Yet the book is ambiguous to those wedded to scholastic language and categories, and who have not expanded their theological horizons as Paul VI had invited the bishops of Vatican II to do. As a skilled theologian and scholar, Peter took account of the criticisms in his future work, and he's been invited to speak and write increasingly since those days. Now, I'm sure Peter was just as surprised as the rest of us on March 13th, 2013, with the election of Pope Francis, a consequence, intended or unintended, of Vatican II, depending on your perspective. Within days, Dominus Jesus was swept aside, as were the further restrictions awaiting the papal signature that Pope Francis found on his desk on his first day at work. On September 23, 2015, addressing the U.S. bishops in Washington, Pope Francis urged them to promote a culture of encounter. I know that you face many challenges, and that the field in which you sow is unyielding, and that there is always temptation to give in to fear, to lick one's wounds, to think back on bygone times, and to devise harsh responses to fierce opposition. And yet we are promoters of a culture of encounter. We are living sacraments of the embrace between God's riches and our poverty. We are witnesses of the abasement and condescension of God, who anticipates in love our every response. Dialogue is our method, not a shrewd strategy, but out of fidelity to the one who never wearies of visiting that marketplace, even in the 11th hour, to propose his offer of love. Throughout his talks and writings, Pope Francis has taken up the language and methodologies that Peter Phan has boldly introduced. Encounter, accompaniment, cross-thinking, emphasizing the local context, spiritual engagement, and sharing interreligious belonging. Peter has recently provided a theological basis for addressing questions of immigration and refugees, which are very much on the mind of Pope Francis. We are back to an era of theology on the way, asking questions with implications for the future of our relationships across religious borders. Those borders are far more porous these days. Now, my first Asian language was Vietnamese. taught to me free of charge by the U.S. Army. 30 hours a week for 30 weeks. And my counterparts in Vietnam taught me their cultural ways. I returned to graduate studies, and after digging into Sanskrit, I studied Chinese, even reading Confucian classics in the original. Great skills I had at one time. But what never left me were the lessons of etiquette of the Confucian tradition. An elder brother or not, if even by 1 hour, much less 3 months, as Peter is to me, if the birther controversy is not here, is always my elder brother. Thus, this most humble younger brother draws attention to the prophetic voice of elder brother who anticipated these latter days of Pope Francis. Peter suggests in Being Religious Interreligiously, using his own words, the way forward in 2004 that are no less true than 2017. It is allied not with the powerful and imperial, but opting for and living in solidarity with the poor and the marginalized, willing to empty ourselves of our cultural traditions and to learn from the treasures of others, humbly walking side by side with other seekers of God and God's reign, witnessing to them our faith in Jesus as God's gift of all-inclusive love to humanity, and recognizing the presence of God's Spirit among them, and learning from them ways of being more faithful to God's call. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Our next speaker, it's also a great privilege and pleasure to introduce, is Chester Gillis, who is the Dean here at Georgetown College of the College of Arts and Sciences. Chet is also, of course, a professor of theology and did his own doctoral work on religious pluralism, and particularly the work of John Hick. Chet previously held the Amaturo Chair in Catholic Studies. The quality of the occupant of that chair has gone downhill since Chet relinquished it. Chet has served at the faculty of Georgetown since 1988. He was chair of the Department of Theology from 2001 to 2006, and director of the Doctor of Liberal Studies program from 2006 to 2008. Chet received the Excellence in Teaching Award from the Liberal Studies program in 2005. He was previously a research fellow focused on the Catholic Church and interreligious dialogue at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs. In 2008, Chet was faculty mentor for the Berkeley Center's Undergraduate Fellows Program. Chet's many publications include, among others, Welcoming the Religious Other to a Catholic University, Catholic Faith in America, The Political Papacy, and Pluralism, A New Paradigm for Theology. He holds degrees in philosophy and religious studies from the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium, and earned his PhD from the University of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Chester Gillis.
Thank you, Gerard. And thank you for organizing this conference. And Peter, my friend, I will take some credit for having you be here. I was the chair of the theology department at the time that we hired Peter. What a wonderful hire.
What a mistake.
Look what's happened. I get very nervous when Peter gets a cold, because when he coughs, a book comes out. In their document, Clarifications Required by the Book, Being Religious Interreligiously, Asian Perspectives on Interfaith Dialogue by Peter Phan, the Committee on Doctrine of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops stated, Being Religious Interreligiously defends the view, quote, that the non-Christian religions possess an autonomous function in the history of salvation, different from that of Christianity, end quote, and that, quote, they cannot be reduced to Christianity in terms of preparation and fulfillment. The book asserts, religious pluralism is not just a matter of fact, but also a matter of principle. That is, non-Christian religions may be seen as part of the plan of divine providence and endowed with a particular role in the history of salvation. These theologians, that is Peter, as they wrote, believe that it is necessary to go beyond the Second Vatican Council's position and to assert, quote, that these religions may be said to be ways of salvation, and that religious pluralism is part of God's providential plan. Well, after years of administrative duties, I'm returning to scholarship, writing a book tentatively titled, Two Shall Become as One, ? Interreligious Marriage in America. In this book, I'm examining religious pluralism on the ground in the most intimate and important relationship, marriage. In these exogamous marriages, I argue that religious pluralism, as Peter has said, is part of God's plan. One dimension that young about-to-be marrieds no longer consider as important as previous generations is religious compatibility. Only 42% of young singles consider it important to find a spouse of the same religion. In fact, religion itself carries less significance. They want someone who shares a common spiritual interest, but this does not necessarily translate into a religion or a denomination. While religion may not be the determining factor in a marriage relationship, the fact that 75% of marriages in America still take place in a church or a synagogue means that religion plays some role in the majority of marriages in America. Exogamous marriages produce complications that endogamous ones do not, and interfaith couples cannot afford to be sanguine about them. At the same time, religious difference should not inhibit couples from pursuing a relationship and marriage. Negotiating difference is never easy, and religious difference presents unique and sensitive challenges. After all, if someone has been taught all her life that her religion is the right one, the implication follows that the other religions are somehow, or to some degree, wrong. Her heart may be telling her that this is the right man, but her religious upbringing delivers a different message. However, different does not necessarily imply wrong. The theological thinking that she was exposed to in her religion, no doubt, centered on a single religious path to God, and did not suggest that other available paths may also lead to God. In my view, God cannot be sequestered, and religions should treat one another with greater respect and encourage mutual understanding. Religious provincialism seems to be a natural state of being for many religious communities. By separating themselves from the other, they can more easily ensure their own doctrine. John Bowker correctly argues that religions are natively conservative and attempt to draw boundaries that separate and distinguish them from other religions. The dilemma that confronts religions in the 21st century is not how these religions can survive on their own, but how they can survive together. Concretely, the pluralism of religions in the United States means that no matter where you live, your religion exists alongside one or several others. In some rural areas, the diversity may be confined to two Christian denominations coexisting, perhaps one with a significant majority presence and the other minority. In cities, one encounters multiple expressions of Christianity and perhaps a few other religions. In major metropolitan areas, the panoply of the world's religions abides in neighborhoods and is evident in the diversity of worship spaces from gurdwaras to synagogues, churches, meeting halls, and temples. Clearly, the statistics support the notion that religious unity affords greater stability to marriages. Nevertheless, not everyone finds the love of their life at church. Social and professional circles foster contact with a wide variety of people who come from a variety of religious backgrounds. In America, people fall in love with all kinds of people. In some nations where marriages are generally arranged, such is not the case. Families involve themselves deeply in the negotiations that lead to marriage, and religion plays a key role in the decision-making process. The tradition of marriage for love in the United States allows greater autonomy for those who wish to pursue marriage, but its lack of restrictions also sometimes complicates the process of choosing a spouse. In our multicultural society, some may opine that religious difference makes no difference, but that is naive. However, to suggest that religious difference erects insurmountable barriers is equally naive. Religious difference must be addressed and negotiated thoughtfully by each partner if the couple wants the relationship to evolve into a permanent union. And the wedding symbolizes a moment in this process, not an end to it. religious identification or non-identification, practice or lack of practice, children's religious affiliation, significant life markers, birth, adulthood, marriage, death, for example, and family traditions must all be negotiated. Even for those who are not religious, they must agree with each other to be so. Couples may not wish to admit that their religious differences matter, or they may be reluctant to face the inevitable issues that religious difference surfaces. Love may conquer all, but not without a struggle. Exploration of religious identification or non-identification does not seem the usual topic with which romance begins, but it is sometimes one at which it ends, and therefore must be taken seriously. And I can tell you stories from people. I had a student at Georgetown who was a Christian student here, Catholic, who fell in love with a Muslim man, and he went on to Yale Law, quite an accomplished scholar, and she went for his graduation, and the family banned her from all the activities because she wasn't a Muslim. This is not that long ago. There's examples in other communities too, but that's the kind of thing on the ground where religious pluralism meets the theory. In many cases, one partner chooses to convert to the other's religion. This encourages harmony only when the conversion is undertaken not simply for convenience, but with genuine conviction. In other cases, each partner plans to continue to practice his or her religion, respecting the religion of the other and conferring on the children a dual religious identity. Others begin their religious life anew by joining a neutral religion that is new to each partner, thus not favoring either previous religious identification. In some instances, the couples choose to abandon religion altogether. All of these choices have inherent complications that affect the couple and confront them with decisions regarding the single religious, dual religious, or non-religious identity of children. While the trend towards an increasing number of interreligious marriages signals a decline in religious isolation and bigotry, it also creates complications that may have not been anticipated. For example, a minority religion like Judaism faces the debilitating effects that assimilation by marriage presents. In the 1920s, only 2% of Jews married Christians in America. Today, that number has increased to over 50%. Marriages between Muslims and Christians, now more common than a generation ago, require delicate negotiations about religious and cultural practices that affect couples and their families. The same is true for Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and others who now have a significant presence in America. Marriage commitments and ceremonies often require creativity and concessions, but they represent only the beginning of interfaith decisions that multiply with child rearing, religious practice, and social relations. Of course, not all couples believe that the religious dimension of marriage represents a vital aspect of married life. Substantial numbers of Americans do not take religion seriously, and it plays little to no role in their conception of marriage. This ranges from outright antagonism toward religious identification to apathy. Often couples maintain a veneer of religion by having some quasi-religious ceremony to begin their married life. But the motives for this range from placating parents and relatives to lack of another ceremonial model that is sufficiently dignified. How many marriages have you been to lately where the minister was universalchurch.com? I've been to several in the last couple of years who got their credentials the day before. And the ceremonies are usually not eloquent, shall I say. Whether or not couples are devout, religion virtually always must be considered when choosing a partner. This remains as true for those who profess no religion as it does for the weekly churchgoer, because religion touches not only individuals and couples but families and society. For some, religion represents customs and traditions that are easily tied to ethnicity and family as they are to religious practice. Thus, even those who do not practice their religion by going regularly to religious services, or who do so only a few times a year or on widely celebrated occasions, such as for Christians Easter and Christmas, or for Jews Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, religion maintains an importance that exhibits itself plainly when considerations of marriage arise. A dimension that may be in the background in daily life often comes to the foreground when considering a marriage partner. Usually, potential mates do not inquire about religious identification when they first meet for dinner or a movie. And even for me to say when they date, I'm dated. Nobody dates anymore, but anyway. But when they establish a relationship, inevitably what religion each professes becomes known, making it a bridge or a potential obstacle. And if the couple does not broach this subject, family members surely will inquire. Parents, grandparents, siblings, relatives, and friends will exhibit a natural curiosity about a potential mate's background, family, profession, and religion. It may be none of their business, but this will not prevent them from asking. When a potential partner's religion turns out to be different, often it is cause for advice, speculation, and concern. I'm reminded of when I met my wife's parents, and they said, "Is he Catholic?" And she said, "Oh, wait till you find out. He's a Catholic theologian." But since I was a Catholic theologian, they knew there was a big future. I always say my wife is a gold digger for marrying a theologian. She could just see the low two figures for life. After all, if she is from New York and he is from Seattle, people will wonder where they will make a home. If she is a Methodist and he is Jewish, how will they negotiate difference? In the words of the popular play The Fantastics, a bird can love a fish, but where do they make a home? If it were only theological differences that couples must negotiate, that task would be difficult but focused. However, religious difference implies a host of other areas of concern, not limited to, but including social, familial, cultural, and personal. What sacred days does an interfaith couple celebrate when their traditions differ? What do they serve at table when two extended families with different dietary sensitivities and restrictions sit together? Who in the extended family is likely to be offended by their food, symbols, or religious participation or non-participation? For many, religion intertwines with culture such that the two become inseparable. To be Jewish, for some, may not necessarily mean being religious, but it does mean being Jewish. To be Muslim implies Islamic culture as well as religion. To be Hindu means that caste carries significance. To be Buddhist means that nonviolence is a way of life. For the majority of Americans, religion is important, and to deny this is to set oneself up for trouble. Exogamous marriages produce complications that endogamous ones do not, and interfaith couples cannot afford to be sanguine about them. At the same time, religious difference should not inhibit couples from pursuing a relationship in marriage. For cultural, social, and religious reasons, some may try to prevent interreligious marriage, but no one disputes their increasing presence in America. Religious communities may seek to preserve their identity, parents may discourage their children from seeing potential marriage partners from another faith, and society may look awkwardly at interreligious combinations. Yet despite these disincentives, such unions are increasing, not decreasing in the United States. Different theologies have engendered different religious identities that often pit one religious person or religious community against another. These theologies often clash into one another in awkward and painful ways when persons from different religions contemplate or enter into marriage. Some prefer to circle the wagons and protect the purity of their religious identity at all costs. However, this strategy only works imperfectly unless strict vigilance and enforcement accompany it. Even when it succeeds, it can lead to a xenophobia that separates and distinguishes the religious community from those of its neighbors. Unless the members of a community live in close proximity to one another, maintaining religious purity usually becomes problematic. Some may wish to promote exclusively intra-religious marriages for reason of religious purity. Others may want to protect the ethnic identity of the community. Each of these objectives has an internally coherent logic as long as purity does not imply prejudice. No one faults communities for preferring their own, and indeed these congruent combinations often work best. If the preference implies denigration of those who are religiously different, then it casts a different shadow over the community. Religion provides a rich dimension of commonality for couples and thus accords a legitimate priority when seeking a spouse. Shared dimensions lay the foundation for harmony in a marriage. Differences bring novelty and often expand the horizons of each partner, but they also present obstacles. The obstacle of religious difference must be taken seriously, but it should not be considered insurmountable. Most religious communities do not teach their adherents how to negotiate religious difference. Instead, they create theologies of separation and pastoral practices that cater to their own and largely ignore the religiously other or treat them as an aberration. They think and act as if God has been revealed exclusively to them, even though they know the world is religiously plural. However, those who believe differently for them are not about to disappear, and ignoring them fosters ignorance that, as we have seen time and again, leads to characters and misunderstanding. The time to think about religious differences is before marriage. However, the time for love is before and during marriage, and that can be the characteristic that makes all the difference. A theological investigation into interreligious marriage needs to begin with God. However, that starting point lacks specificity and clarity, particularly when examining the broad phenomenon of religion across the spectrum of religions. Since religions do not conceive of God in identical ways, and since some conceptions contradict one another, a theological analysis requires careful accounting of how different religions describe the transcendent. A key thesis of this project centers on how the construction and use of theological categories and theories affects the appropriation of religion, and this appropriation in turn affects self-understanding, attitudes, beliefs, and practices of religious believers. These dispositions then affect how the believer interprets the religion of the other and how he or she relates to the religiously other person. One may be suspicious of those who do not share fundamental religious categories in an identical manner, or one may think that they may misinterpret who or what God is and how God relates to humankind. These capture precisely the suspicions that complicate interreligious marriage and can interfere easily with the ability to understand one's religiously other person. Most religious persons grow up believing that one well-formulated definition of God is the only one. From the profoundly simple Quranic manifestation that there is one God to the more complicated theology of the Trinity, religions fundamentally subscribe to an internally coherent and uniform definition of the transcendent. Adherents of the religion usually learn the definition early in childhood and experience reinforcement regularly in prayer and worship. However, they appropriate not simply as convenient or a useful definition, but as a true one. They believe it because they think it is not merely a suitable description, because they believe that their description is true. Thus, the Muslim believes that God is uniquely one and Muhammad is his messenger. The Christian professes that God is three persons in one. The Hindu believes that multiple manifestations of gods and goddesses represent Brahman, the ultimate reality. These descriptions of the transcendent usually rest on revelation disclosed in a text through a prophet or an epiphany. The originating text, persons, and events occupy a privileged place in the religion's heritage and influence the construction of systems of belief. Over time, followers of the religion clarify and codify the original elements, proposing authoritative interpretations and structuring the resulting beliefs and practices in what can be commonly described as a religion. A community that forms, that holds certain beliefs in common and uniform practices arise that further define and solidify the community of believers. These developments enable the religion to form a distinctive character, a set of beliefs and practices, a community that all separate them from other identifiable communities. Without these evolutions, the religion likely would not survive its infancy. Forging a clear and distinct identity aids the social bonding necessary. The process I'm describing does not occur in a matter of mere years or over decades, but centuries and generations. Those born today both reap the benefit of this legacy and are heirs to centuries of refinement. At the same time, however, they are hostage to sometimes arcane formulations, historical disputes, and differing sects of the same religion. What may have started out pure gets muddy with time and human manipulation. But theological theories and teachings play a role in these situations, since they ground the beliefs and the religions of the religious practitioners, and they should not be ignored or considered mere theories without consequence. I am trying to think through the understanding of God across traditions so that people who are in these kind of marriages can understand and appreciate and respect one another in a deeper and more formal manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chet. It's also a pleasure and a privilege to introduce our next speaker, all the way from Italy. Deborah Tonelli is a professor and researcher at the University of Trento in northern Italy's Institute for Religious Sciences, based at the Fondazione Brunel Kessler, FB Kappa. She also teaches for the faculties of politics and of political science at the Pontifical Universities of Sant'Anselmo, and for the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Pontifical Gregorian University, the Jesuit University in Rome. Deborah has established a research network that encourages collaboration on the topics of religion and violence between various Italian and international universities, including FB Kappa Trento, Roma Tor Vergata, the Forum Fiorentino por la Pace e la Guerra, Milano Università Statale, and Milano Università Bicocca. She is presently working on an interdisciplinary book on violence in relation to various different religions, as well as working to broaden international participation in the research network. And we're also delighted that she is a visiting researcher this semester at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs here at Georgetown. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Tinelli.
Congratulations for your Italian, that it's better of my English, so I apologize for my English. But first of all, I'd like to thank the director of Berkeley Center, Professor Benshoff, and of course extend my warm thanks to Gerard Mannion for inviting to this celebration of our Peter Fan. It's a really honor to be here today. And not last, I'd like to thank Amy Phillips for correcting my English text. Of course, she is not responsible for the content and for my bad pronunciation. So, when I was a student in the Faculty of Theology in Rome, the theology of religion was only just appearing in our programs. Exactly what this emerging field meant was not clear, but we students had the impression that a deep change was happening. At the time, I didn't comprehend precisely the meaning of the theology of religions, and I preferred to work on the Hebrew Bible, which was the foundation of my research in political philosophy. My presupposition was that the biblical tradition, before being a spiritual and a religious one, is political, because it testifies to relation among humans, among believers, and with God. Every human relationship is, in the sense of inherent, apolitical relationships. Of course, the biblical tradition is not only political, but I consider unacceptable the polarization between religion and culture, religion and politics, religion and economy, and so on. This dichotomy is a legacy of enlightenment. After years of research, my first impression on biblical tradition was not contradicted. Politics and religion are closely linked. The relationships among religions are political before being spiritual or religious. At the same time, the biblical tradition continues to be part of social political debates, directly or indirectly, consciously or not. We have to think, for example, about the debates of the inclusion of biblical tradition in the European Constitution. The European policy was developing a new vision of religious and its inclusion in the political space. Or to think about the use of sacred text to justify religious words and fundamentalism and to counter them. From a theological point of view, the contribution of Peter Fan to the inclusion of religiosity in the social political debates is unquestionably important. In the decades in which I started to note of contemporary political debates, it was impossible not to cross such issues as secularization, religious pluralism, interreligious dialogue, and so on. The question was always the same. What does it mean to be religious today? In this talk, I will try to delineate briefly some connection between religion and politics in the horizon of religious pluralism and to show the need for each to interact with the other and what this interaction can offer us. Some recent books analyze the role of the faith in contemporary world. One of them is the Hans Joss book, Faith as an Option, Possible Futures for Christianity. In this book, the German sociologist asks how the believers today can intellectually justify their belief. His book is focused on secularization, and the author argues that the emergence of a secular option does not mean that the religion must decline. but that believers must understand that their faith is one option among many. He calls upon faith to articulate contemporary experiences. Churches and the religious communities must take into account religious diversity, but the modern world is not a threat to Christianity or to faith in general. On the contrary, Jos says modernity and faith can be mutually enriching. What does mutually enriching mean? In our contemporary world, we are continuously urged to transform challenges into opportunities. This is an optimistic vision, which permits us to have a self-understanding of our relationships and aid us in developing the ability for reflecting on not making rash or haphazard decisions before unexpected. But the question remains, what does it mean to be religious in a global environment inhabited by pluralism or indifference or hostility to religious experience? The question arises from the need to interpret the present through new categories and approaches. Today, being religious doesn't legitimate forced conversions or allow for a sense of superiority. Yet it need not mean giving up a certain pride in their religious affiliation. At the same time, we have to consider scientific progress that permits us to distinguish among myths and religious traditions. So Peter Fan has written prophetical books. The prophet is not one who foresees the future, but in a biblical sense, one who knows so well the tradition and sees so clearly the present that enables one to have the key to imagine the future and thus enabled to propose an alternative future. The imagination is one of the most important characteristics of theologians and politicians. It is the ability to look behind and to create something unexpected. I think it's not accidental that the analysis of foolish wisdom is in the first chapter of Being Religious Interreligiously. Some of Fan's prophecies are coming true, others will come true when the time will be ripe. The title of this book is an excellent synthesis of the contemporary issue of religion in a context in which we cannot be indifferent to pluralism. Interreligiously means, first of all, that we have to take into account religions different from our own, and to try to build a kind of relationships with them. These relationships is more than religious, because it influences politics, culture, society. Nevertheless, too often religion and theology are not able or legitimated to participate in social political debates. In which way does this distinction of environment influence the development of the debates on religion and the strategies of interreligious dialogue? I think in a negative way. If we consider human beings in a holistic sense, that is a whole. In a health personal, actions are consequence of an inner vision, or in a Taylorian sense, our actions are consequences of moral evaluations. From this point of view, it's very difficult to distinguish our belief from public actions, habitus moralis from political relations, and our every action will be part of a wider horizon. Religion is today one among many options. However, it still provides a certain cosmic and individual order and a way of making reality intelligible. In ancient times, the aim of the Greek cosmogony and the biblical mythos of creation was to explain the status of the world and to show the superiority of a deity upon the chaos, interpreted as absence of meaning. In this worldview, history began with this release of the chaos and the beginning of order. Today we are orphans of this meaningless framework, and no religion can claim universal meaning. Nevertheless, despite the disenchantment of the world, believers and not believers have not given up this claim to religion as a source of order. Indirectly, we could suppose that the attribution of religion of contemporary conflicts is caused by this atavistic combination between religion and order. We expect that if a religion is well working, order will rule the world. Socio-political chaos could be interpreted, first of all, as a consequence of the inability of religion to offer a meaningful context. For an analogy, we could interpret the interreligious dialogue as a research of global order that can help us to find answers or develop new vision, perspectives, interpretations in relation to the chaos of the contemporary situation. Only from this point of calm we will be able to find the tools and a strategy that allows us to act in a constructive way in situations of conflict. How this translates in contingent reality, it is hard to say. But certainly we should stop continuing to distinguish between religions and public space, politics and interreligious dialogue. Think, for example, to the European debates to include biblical tradition in our constitutions. It was symptomatic of the difficulty to consider religion in the public space and its contribution to European cultural history. One of the merits of Peter Fan was urge the Catholic Church to take a stand with regard to interreligious dialogue. This means to create a new global order behind our religious experience. Only an Asiatic theologian could explore in this innovative way the intersections among religions and culture. Only one who is continuously between different cultural worlds can translate a Semitic Western religious tradition into Asiatic faith experience. We are too much inheritors of enlightenment to understand the need to build a new vision of the world based not only on rationality, but also on human experience and on dialogue. As Fan wrote in his book, turned into a primarily deconstructive instrument to unmask oppressive structures, reason remains unable to offer a constructive vision of reality. Personal experience allows to overcome this vision. It therefore follows that he finds an alternative between logos and mythos in the wisdom of folly. And Peter Fan wrote, "The purpose of this chapter is not to provide an account of how foolish wisdom or the wisdom of folly has functioned in diverse fields of human endeavor, but to show how this peculiar way of knowing, which is distinct from mythos and logos, can, if properly practiced, lead to the recovery of the love of wisdom." In some way, the prophetic imagination of Fan is foolish because it breaks all schemes. On one side, his thought starts from contingent needs. On the other side, his faith and his theological reflections transcend them. His idea of religious pluralism is based on the idea of humanity, not ideal, but real. Dialogue is too often considered an ambiguous weapon. To counter this ambiguity, the German philosopher Karl Otto Appel, for example, elaborated a rational vision of discourse. According to this vision, only rational humans can participate to public discourse, and its rules are rational. Rationality produces the illusion of control. In fancy realism, dialogues requires sensibility and the strike balance between many intangible characteristics. Dialogue is, first of all, a way for sharing experience and building relationships. If we share our deepest experience, such as religious experiences, this cannot be without consequence in our public life. The human being is an infra-being in the meaning of Arendt. Political activity is the most important because in it is possible to realize this infra, discussing our deepest convictions and finding solutions together. As with religion, the political space is characterized by freedom. There doesn't exist an infra without freedom and inequality. But at the end, questions remain. The real problem is to find the criteria to establish their boundaries and the way of translation of a way of life. Thank you.
Grazie mille, Deborah. Thank you very much indeed. So after our final speaker, we'll have time. We're running a little over, just for one or two questions. So I'd like to ask you to try and think of trying to formulate a question that could really be addressed to the entire panel, and to formulate it very briefly and succinctly. So just try to be thinking about that, a question that each of the panel could perhaps speak to, and perhaps we will have time for one or two of those at the finish. So it is also a real privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor Keith Ward as our final speaker for today. If John spoke about Peter as his slightly older brother, Keith Ward is my doctorvater, so my doctoral supervisor. So it's wonderful to have Keith and his wife Marion here in Washington, D.C. And Keith is a British philosopher, a theologian, a priest and a scholar. He's also a gentleman. He is a fellow of the British Academy and a priest of the Church of England. He was a canon of Christ Church Cathedral. For those of you who are Harry Potter's fans, this is where much of the film was filmed, until 2003. Comparative theology and the relationship between science and religion are two of Keith's many main topics of interest. Keith was Regius Professor of Divinity, appointed by the Queen, at the University of Oxford from 1991 to 2004. He's the author of many, many books, including The Rule of Love, Religion and Human Nature, Why There Is Almost Certainly a God, and recently Christ and the Cosmos, a reformulation of Trinitarian doctrine. In 1992, Keith delivered the very prestigious Gifford Lectures at the University of Glasgow. He has also served as the Gresham Professor of Divinity at Gresham College in London between 2004-2008, is presently a professorial research fellow attached to Heythrop College, the Jesuit University in the University of London, and is on the Council of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. This semester we are delighted that he is a visiting professor just over the river at Virginia Theological Seminary. Please join me in welcoming Keith Ward.
Well, thank you very much, Gerard. It's great to see Gerard again. It's also a great privilege to be here to speak in honour of Peter Fan. Peter has been a leading thinker in the area of pluralism, other areas too, but that's what I'm going to talk about. I think one phrase which he might at one time at least have used of himself was that he is or was an inclusive pluralist. If you don't know what that means, you're in good company. But I think it's certainly a good thing, whatever it means. I think it's a great step forward for Christian faith personally. Of course, I'm not a Catholic, so that I myself am part of a pluralist community, and not so very long ago it would have been said that I could not be saved. Well, perhaps it still would by some people, but then neither can you, so that's all right. Well, I want to think about inclusive pluralism. Now, I want to make it clear, I'm not actually trying to improve on what Peter did. I can't do that, I don't intend to do that, but I'm going to address it from a slightly different perspective, to look at what I think Peter is saying, which I agree with, and to put it in slightly different terms, because Coming from the UK, I suppose my chief influences in this regard were John Hick and people of that sort, so that there's a slightly different way of approach. Focusing, converging on the same point, I think. Well, you can judge. The first thing I'd want to do in thinking about the relations of religion is compare them. I mean, I've been a philosopher most of my life, and as a philosopher you just get used to the fact that if you say something, everyone else in the room is supposed to disagree with you. And so disagreement is not a problem if you're a philosopher. You don't say that you're more intelligent than everybody else. Well, you do normally, but you might think that. But really you just say, human beings being what they are, you expect there to be disagreement. It's not, you don't have to get involved in things about, do you have the one true faith or something like that. You think, well, what I think is probably true, it's got some mistakes in it, but on the whole, what other people think is probably false, but you don't get worked up about it. So I'm very interested that religious people get worked up about these things, and I wonder why that is, really. I find it rather odd. And I'd want to make a big distinction to start with, between salvation, the question who can be saved, and truth, what is true. And I think these are quite different questions, and sometimes, not Peter, but sometimes people run them together so that you're asking, well, can you be saved and is what you believe true, as if they're the same question. They're not, of course. I think Pope John Paul made this quite clear, as far as I can make out, when he said that it was God's will that everyone should be saved. And I think that's true. There's a nice biblical text for that. As a Protestant, I like biblical texts, and there is a text that God wills everyone to be saved. So I think if God wills that, God will make it possible. And since most people haven't ever heard of Jesus, then, except as a pop singer or something like that, then a pair of jeans, I think, then perhaps you have to say God must make it possible for them to be saved. It can't be through hearing about Jesus. So there must be salvific efficacy in lots of other ways of life, not just religious ones. I think that has to be true if you think that God's love is unlimited and non-excluding. So that's all right. But then I want to make another distinction, which is equally important, between what we now are justified in believing and what we will ultimately, when we're dead, right, and perhaps a long time after we're dead, I don't know, be justified in believing. And I want to say, well, what a little child of 6 is justified in believing is quite different from what an adult who's been to university is justified in believing. They're the same person, but you wouldn't expect the same things to be true of them when you ask about justification. In the same way, I think when any human being in this life, in this world, is asked for justification for their belief, you'll get many different answers. And in answer to that question, are they justified in believing things other than the Christian faith? I think the answer would have to be yes, they jolly well are. And they can be redeemed and love God and come to know God on that way, but of course not during this life. That's the point, because they're never going to think there is a God. I mean, if you're a very hardline Buddhist, you'll say there isn't a God, and that's a superstition, and I don't want to love God, I think that's a bad thing. So you say, well, that's hard to see that they're going to be living forever with God if that's not what they want. So that is true. And I suppose what the Christian then has to say, and what the Buddhists could also say from their own point of view, is, well, but when you're dead, you'll know. Right? And this is what John Hick called eschatological verification. That at some time, truth and salvation have to connect. I mean, when you are finally saved, when you love God and you know God fully, then you know the truth. That's correct. So truth and salvation are then connected, but they're not connected now. Now, in this life, it's true that even people like me, who according to lots of you, I believe lots of false things, I can still be saved. Right? So I can be saved even if I believe false things, and I hope that is true of everybody. It all depends what the false things are, really. So there you are. So with those two distinctions, I want to say, well, in this life, there's no problem with seeing many different religions, and humanism too, as salvific, as setting people off towards what Christians believe is salvation, although they don't believe that at the moment. And then you could say, well, and finally, in the life in the world to come, then truth will converge, and you find out, of course, we believe as Christians, I think, that Christ is the one and only way to salvation. Eventually, that's the point, eventually. So there's that point that I want to make. But then truth has to be connected to salvation, and we have to think that what we believe is true. I believe it's logically necessary that if you believe X is true, you must believe that not X is false. So it's a necessary condition of claiming truth that other people can believe things which aren't true. So I'm not a pluralist in the sense of thinking, well, this is Ratzinger's relativism, really, that lots of different things, even if they're contradictory, can be true. I know there are some people who believe that, but I don't think that's possible. And so you have to say, well, truth is exclusive. It excludes the opposite of what it's asserting. But then you look at religious truth claims and things get a bit more difficult. And they get difficult because truth is a property of propositions. It is propositions. It is in a language. Some statement in a language is said to be true or false. Now, a language is meant to reflect reality. But there are lots of questions to ask about the way in which language reflects reality. And let me just quickly name 4, which I think are very important in religion. First of all, languages, the best languages we have, can be inadequate to reality. That should be no surprise to a theologian, that our languages about God are inadequate to the reality of God. If in physics you think you have a language, most people have a language about electrons as little planetary-like things going around the nucleus of an atom. Now, any proper physicist knows that is false. It's actually false. It's a very inadequate view. It's like a Sunday school view of what an electron is. But it's all people can cope with. So you say, is that language about electrons as little particles going around a nucleus, is that adequate? The answer every physicist will give you is no, it's not adequate. And if you say, well, can you do any better? They'll say, well, if you take a course, a couple of PhDs in mathematics, I can do better. But apart from that, no, you just have to stick with it. So adequacy is important. And if you say, I know that a lot of what I think about God, and I'm speaking personally now, is inadequate, then how certain can I be that actually somebody else's inadequate view, right, is more inadequate than mine? But I can think that, but I've got to have a little bit of humility and say, well, if all languages are inadequate, then things are a bit more difficult than saying, I know this is a desk, well, it's not actually a lectern, and if you say it's an elephant, I know you're wrong. But then, if it's a question of electrons, you might be in greater difficulty. If it's about God, you'd be in a huge... So that's the first thing, right? Adequacy. The second one is, well, our terms about God and about salvation, are they literal? When Jesus is reported to having called himself the Son of Man, is that a literal statement? And that's a very difficult question to answer. Or if you say Jesus ascended into heaven, is that a literal statement? So again, this qualifies the notion of truth. So I'm starting off with exclusivism. Truth must exclude error. But then I'm saying, well, it's a bit difficult if a statement is not literally true to say exactly what it excludes. Let me give you an example. Some people will say of me, I am a fox. He is a fox, they'd say of me. And you say, is that true? Does it exclude it being true that he is a lion? Well, no, it doesn't really, because those terms are not literally true. Now, so you've got to think, well, in religion, how much of what is said is not literally true? So adequacy, a question of literalness, and then there are other questions too about religious terms, and I think one of them might be whether your formulation of truth in a certain language is precise or vague. Now, if you say the Trinity is three persons in one substance, is that a precise statement? Well, the truth is, it depends on who you're talking to, because most people don't know what it means at all. I've even heard priests who don't know what it means. But to know what it means, you'd have to know what persona, prosopa, substantia, ousia, what they all mean, what they meant when the original documents were written. There's a lot you'd have to understand, and then you'd have to ask, well, how do we transfer all these terms into something contemporary? So rigidity and precision are not always required of religious statements. Let me give you an example from the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogues on the Mass. You probably know that the Roman Catholic theologians in Archic and the Anglican theologians all agreed on what was going on in the Mass. Complete agreement. But the Pope, well, the Vatican didn't agree, and the General Synod of the Church of England, which is even more important, didn't agree either. And the point was about the word transubstantiation. Now again, some of us would want to say that's just too precise. You've got to learn a lot about Aristotle. You've got to believe there are substances with accidents. You've got to believe you can detach accidents from their substances. Well, you know, you can have that philosophical argument, but what's it got to do with the Mass? Well, all right, you might say it has a lot to do with it. But the question is, what is the precision of such statements? Some religious views are stated very precisely, but others are very vague and imprecise. Now, when you make statements about God, are you being really precise? You have to believe exactly this. You have to say three persons in one substance. You can't say three modes of being in one subsistence, as some naughty Roman Catholic theologians have said. So what are you going to do about that? So what I'm saying is, right, truth is exclusive. Salvation is inclusive. Exclusive truths exclude the contradictories. But when you're talking about religious propositions in a certain language, which the terms of which might have varying degrees of precision, might have varying degrees of literalness and symbolic character, and might have varying degrees of adequacy to the reality anyway, you're in a world which is very fluid. You're in a world where we have what the philosopher Quine called a conceptual web, with a central core of very important concepts: God, Jesus, covenant, salvation, and then a peripheral core of less important concepts, but they're all bound together. And these webs of concepts actually don't form rigid, excluding sets of absolutely precisely true propositions. That propositions aren't all that important in religion. Perhaps Christianity is almost unique in making propositional thought more important than practice, or as important. There are some religious views which you wouldn't think that at all. When I speak, as I have done in Japan, I'm always accused of being a Western logician, because I'm being too precise. I don't say, what is a kami exactly? And they say, that's not the point, that's a Western way of thinking. Well, whatever you do about that, there's obviously a difference between people who want nice, precise definitions, which will exclude, you see, their contraries and contradictories, and having more evocative, more symbolic, more vague propositions. Those all are important. So when you're looking at the religious perspective that exists in the world, it's not so clear that the truth as we express it in our language with our concepts excludes language which is very different and which is perhaps framed also in inadequate and symbolic and imprecise ways. So if you have symbolic, imprecise and inadequate conceptual systems existing, they perhaps can blend and mix. And that, I think, might leave you with something that Peter might call inclusive pluralism.